right, you guys, welcome back to the channel. I am so excited to have you here today. Thank you for clicking on this video. So today I want to discuss something that has been on my mind for a while, and that is, why is Gen Z particularly mentally ill? Because they are leaps and bounds ahead of any previous generation. So I want to discuss why the hell that is happening, at least in my opinion and from my observations. But before we can get into any of that, this is your reminder to subscribe to this channel and give this video a thumbs up. It really does help me out a ton. And if you want to follow me on any other social medias, those are linked down below as always. And without any further ado, let's just dive right in. Okay, so I feel that it is pretty common knowledge that Gen Z is the most mentally ill. We are unwell. We are a deeply unwell generation. And I do feel like it makes sense when you look at a couple of different factors. I feel like this generation really did get kind of the short end of the stick, just with a bunch of various things that we're going to talk about. I mean, the rates of depression, anxiety, the lack of coping mechanisms among this generation is absolutely insane. And I feel like it comes down to, I feel like there are three large factors. And I feel like each of these factors impacted this generation at the different developmental stages. And obviously this does not apply to everyone, but for those who it does apply to, Lord, does it apply? So those three stages are in childhood with gentle parenting. I think that Gen Z was amongst the first generations to be gentle parented. And then moving into their teenage years, we saw the introduction of social media. I mean, millennials had things like MySpace and the beginnings of Facebook, but I think social media really took a turn when it came to things such as Instagram, for example. So you had that. And then once you reach kind of the coming of age, 18, 20, those ages, there was a pandemic, folks. So at nearly every important turn, there was something new happening. And I think that that really impacted this generation. So I want to look at these each one by one and discuss exactly how I think these things impacted the mental health of this entire generation. Okay, so taking these one by one, let's look at social media. So speaking from personal experience, I was amongst the first to be on Instagram. I remember when the app launched, and I would definitely say that I was too young. I would definitely say that a lot of teenagers were too young to be on that app. And I think that the effects were felt pretty immediately, because one thing about teenage girls is that they are inherently self-conscious. It is a boys too, but I think particularly for girls, there are a lot more obvious changes. It's a very uncomfortable time in a person's life to be a teenager. And once upon a time, children were going through that in a normal, functional way. They had their friend group, they had their family, maybe a church, a community, something physical around them. Nowadays, you are on Instagram, and I know especially in 2012, 2013, 14, when Instagram was first kind of getting its footing, it was so new that people didn't really understand that photos weren't real. Photos were edited. So you had these teenage girls who are just starting to develop, maybe getting acne, all of these things. All of a sudden, now they're comparing themselves to Kendall Jenner. And the effects of that were very detrimental, because when you see somebody who looks like Kendall Jenner and you look in the mirror and you look nothing like that, for a teenage girl, that can be very harmful, especially considering at that age, you already feel like the odd one out, kind of what I was talking about. There are so many different factors. Your boobs either haven't grown fast enough or grew way too fast. Maybe you grew 4 inches over the summer, and now you tower over every boy in your grade. You have acne. If you are particularly unlucky, maybe you have braces. And if you're even more particularly unlucky, maybe you had to have a palate expander because your mouth was too small, and now you have a lisp. So it's very easy for a series of unfortunate events to occur at this point in time. So then to log online and compare yourself to these unrealistic beauty standards, it's very harmful. It's it's very detrimental. It definitely can lead to an increase of anxiety and depression, but that's not the only route to these mental illnesses that social media has, right? Another factor is just kind of what I deem to be the permanent login. When before social media, you would come home from school, and if you had a bad day at school or you were bullied at school, you could at least hopefully get a reprieve. You weren't in constant contact with the kids from school. You could come home and be away from that. But now kids come home and then they log on to Instagram or TikTok, and they're all immediately re-interacting with these kids, and there's just not a break from it. And it's almost like having a lack of work-life balance. Their friend group now becomes absolutely everything, which is typical of that age. Your friend group is incredibly important at that age, but it's also important to have a balance. And social media blurs that line so drastically. I don't know if anyone's actually listening to anything I'm saying, because I am aware that Sweet Sylvie is back here putting on a show for you guys. That is Sylvie, short for Sylvester Stallone. I was in a Rocky phase when I got her. You are so cute. And those are just the immediate impacts of social media. I would say that's not even addressing the lack of sleep that social media can cause. Now, to be totally fair, I feel like every generation of teenagers is going to find a way to stay up late, whether it's reading or playing an old video game or whatever it might be. But the difference with social media is it's more intense. There's a strong sense of FOMO, fear of missing out. If you don't immediately see the video that is sent to you from your friends, you're constantly second guessing something maybe that you posted. It's just a lot more consuming than previous generations' mechanisms of staying up late. And not to mention the blue light that emits off of our devices. All of these different things are so bad, and having a lack of sleep is a huge factor contributing to anxiety and depression. Our bodies need sleep, especially teenagers. Teenagers especially need sleep, and they are not getting it. Now, some argue on the flip side that there are positives to social media, and to an extent, I could see that, but this one particular point I am going to argue against, and that is the idea of having an online community. And the reason I'm going to argue against this is because I once had an online community. Now, if you don't quite understand what I'm referencing, the idea is that, say you have a kid who is not fitting in at school, they can't find a peer group, they don't have anyone that they necessarily hang out with or get along with, they can turn to the internet and find a group online that understands them, that shares interests with them. And this can almost serve as a support system. And on paper, that makes sense. But in reality, I do not think that it plays out this way for the sole reason that humans need social, physical interactions to survive. When I was 14, 15, I was the most depressed I've ever been in my entire life. My anxiety was the highest it's ever been in my entire life. I dropped out of high school and started doing online school because I was having panic attacks every single morning before going to school. And then I would have a second panic attack before going into the lunchroom, because the idea of going into the lunchroom with all of those people scared me literally to death. I would call my mom and beg her to take me to Wendy's or anything to not have to do that. And so she finally agreed to let me do online school. And given the circumstance, because there were certain factors that I'm not going to get into, that was making school absolutely miserable for me. So I do think it was the right choice. However, it also led me to dive headfirst into internet culture. So I know what it's like to feel like you don't have a group of people in real life that you really connect with, and having that online instead. And the thing is, as I said, I've never been more depressed and more anxious in my entire life. But when I was at home on my phone or on my laptop, I felt fine. But if I had to go outside, if I had to interact with somebody in real life, I was terrified of that. And that's not healthy, and that's not normal. And it does stem from encouraging people and children especially to try to find community online. It's just not the natural way that humans interact, and it is a huge contributor to social anxiety. If all of your interactions are on a keyboard, calling to order a pizza is going to give you anxiety because you have to talk to a person. This is just logical. Now, I don't mean this to say that teens shouldn't be allowed to have social media. My stance is that it's going to be there and they're going to use it whether the parent approves or not. You can try and put the restraints on it, but the strict parents create sneaky teenagers is a saying for a reason. So I think the key here is moderation, trying to limit what they're doing at night when they come home from school, making sure that they are taking breaks, essentially. Because a lot of teenagers, especially Gen Z, because Gen Z was the first generation to be of that particular age when things like Instagram launched, and also the iPhone and the advent of smartphones, right? So we kind of were guinea pigs for this whole thing, and I think that we are seeing the consequences of that. Okay, my next boned pick is gentle parenting. I know, I can hear it now. We just want to affirm our children's feelings and make sure that they feel loved and cared about. And yeah, that's great. Of course, love your child, care for your child. But I think that some people who attempt to do gentle parenting take it a little too far. And the whole debate almost is about having compassion. And I think that there's a little bit of a difference of opinion on what constitutes compassion. Not to bring up a hot button issue, but if you know anything about me, you know that I love to bring up a hot button issue. So let's look at the homeless population, because some people would say that the compassionate thing to do would be to not judge them and leave them be and just let them live their lives. Others would say that's the least possible compassionate thing to do. Allowing somebody to be drug-riddled and sleeping on the sidewalk is the opposite of compassion. So I think that sometimes when we have these kinds of conversations, there's a difference of opinion on what constitutes compassion. And I think it's unfair to say that any side or the other doesn't have compassion. We just might disagree on how that looks. So in terms of gentle parenting, personally, I don't think the compassionate thing is to always follow the child's lead. They're a child. An excellent example of this is reacted to a video of this child having an absolute meltdown in Walmart. And this video was absolutely insane because not a single adult stepped in until the very end, when this child is literally breaking glass bottles on the ground, and an adult comes in and picks her because she's maybe 6. This kid was maybe 6 years old, little kid. He just picks her up because at this point she's endangering herself and others. She's throwing glass bottles. And even at that point, another adult in the video steps in and says, "You put her down. You can't do that. You don't know what she's going through, blah, blah, blah." And that's true. I don't know what she's going through. Probably something drastic to be acting this way in public without any adult around her. The gentle parent says, you get down on their level and say, "Talk to me. What's going on? Express to me what you're feeling." The rational parent picks them up and forces them to stop what they're doing. Okay? I think that we have, as a society, have somehow come to a conclusion where we've decided that it's not okay for adults to put their foot down. And I don't understand that. I think it's actually quite detrimental to children because it gives lack of structure. Children need, to a certain extent, to be told what to do. Now, there can be a balance of that. It can be like, for example, if your kid is 2 or 3, you might say, "Do you want to wear this or this?" You give them the option. They can pick, but it's a limited option, because if you just give them their whole closet, you're going to be there all day, I promise. That kid's not going to pick. Most kids are not going to pick because it's overwhelming and it's too much, and they're going to keep changing their mind. I've been there. So I do think that there's a balance to be struck here of trying to raise your child to have some independence and learn to understand their feelings and all of those types of things that gentle parenting tries to accomplish. But you can't lose sight of the fact that you're the adult. and you have to guide this child, and you have to create structure for this child. And another thing that I think gentle parenting gets wrong is affirming every single emotion and almost instilling this idea that everything that a child feels is valid and needs to be expressed. Because when you instill that into a child, because they're going to grow up and think that that's how the real world works, and it doesn't. The real world does not revolve around you and your emotions. And I know for some that's going to be a tough pill to swallow. You are probably gentle parented, or you've read a lot about gentle parenting. The real world does not revolve around you and your emotions. And tying this into the mental health crisis, imagine you have a child who has spent the entirety of their childhood being told that they need to express every emotion that they feel, and that every emotion that they feel is the most important thing. You know, the whole talk to me, use your word, express to me that whole thing. And then they get to be an adult and other adults don't care. Okay? Other adults don't care. That's gonna induce some anxiety. That's gonna be a shock to your system to find out mommy and daddy are probably the only ones who care about your emotions on that grand of a scale. That's not to say that we shouldn't be compassionate and try to understand where other people are coming from, but I think that Gen Z crosses the line. I think that Gen Z goes from having compassion and hearing people out and knowing where they're coming from to you have to affirm what I'm saying and agree with what I'm saying. And if you don't, that is an attack on my person. And that is a pretty drastic jump to have been made. Further, in the same vein as gentle parenting is the participation trophy idea, where you get a reward just for trying. Throughout childhood, you no longer just get a ribbon or a trophy if you win. You now get one for participating. And once again, that does not extend into the real world. You don't get the job just because you tried. You don't get the raise just because you asked for it. You don't get the reward just because you put yourself out there. You actually have to succeed at the thing to get the thing. And once again, when you're raised, dang, I'm sorry you guys, I keep knocking this microphone. When you are raised to believe that you get a reward for trying, and then you get into the real world and that's just not the case, it's going to be anxiety inducing. It's going to probably be depressing. So these things culminate to create a serious mental health crisis. And those are only two factors. And then just for fun, right? We had a pandemic. So I am Gen Z. I'm older Gen Z. I am like right on the cusp of millennial and Gen Z. I turned 21 in 2020. So thankfully for me, I had a little bit of real life experience before the pandemic hit. But imagine that group of kids who went from high school into a pandemic, or high school, a couple years of college, and then into a pandemic. They have not experienced the real world because COVID changed everything. All of a sudden, we're all working from home, which creates more social anxiety because, one, you no longer have to interact with people, and interacting with people is almost a muscle. If you don't use it, you will lose it. And further, there's the risk of killing your grandma if you go outside and breathe the wrong way. So you have this generation of people who are already set up to fail. And now you're telling them that if they go to the grocery store and they don't walk down the aisle a certain direction and Lysol their groceries when they get home, their grandmother's gonna die. I understand that Gen Z is very annoying. It's potentially the most annoying generation. You gotta feel bad for them a little bit. You gotta feel a little bit bad because that is a tough hand to be dealt. Now, that's not to say that you can't overcome that. I like to think that I am one of the few who has overcome that. And I will get a little bit more into my story here in a second. But as somebody who has experienced this crippling social anxiety. It's real. I am not for a second saying that that's not a real thing. I've experienced it, but you can also grow and get past it. So this isn't to say that there isn't any self-accountability, but it is an explanation, I think, because for a lot of people, it's such a strange phenomenon. Why is Gen Z so fucked? I'm sure there's a lot more to it, but these are the factors that stood out the most to me. But all of that said, is there anything that can be done about this? And the initial solution is going to be probably SSRIs. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on this. As somebody who has been on various antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications for, I think I was on them for 7 or 8 years, and has been off of them for 2 or 3 now. I'm going to share my personal experience, and of course, this is not one size fits all. For me, I know that when I first got on them, I felt a little bit better because when I first got on them, I was not in a good place, and I did need some regulation. But I think I stayed on them far too long. And that is, I think, the bottom line is I do not think that SSRIs are intended to be permanent. And a lot of people have been on them for decades. I think that now, of course, there are people who have more serious illnesses, bipolar disorder, major depressive. There are circumstances where obviously talk to your doctor, but there are more serious circumstances. I'm not talking about those. I am talking about cases where you have a hard time getting out of bed, or the idea of making a phone call makes your palms sweaty. Things that are more manageable, and you might need a little bit of help initially. My personal suggestion is to try other things first, because I also think a big problem is people are jumping to SSRIs immediately before they really try other things, because it seems like an easy out. Because getting back to my story, for me, I was on them for years and years and years until I was around 22, I want to say. I had an event in my life that was like a huge life-changing event, and I don't know, I just got so busy and I just kept forgetting to take them, and one day I realized that I hadn't been taking them. Like I was taking it maybe once a week, and I realized at this rate it's not really doing anything for me, but I feel fine. So I decided to just stop taking it, and I feel the most stable since I've stopped taking them than I ever felt on them. I would have major mood swings, major up and downs while I was on them, and since I've gotten off of them, that has stopped. Now, that is just my personal experience. I have not looked at studies on this, so I'm not making any recommendations. I am just saying that it is a possibility that they could be doing more harm than good, and looking into alternatives is never a bad thing. For example, if you are on anti-anxiety medication, maybe exposing to yourself to things that induce your anxiety, it's called exposure therapy, could be something that will help you, and then you would be able to get off of the medication. Because what's kind of insane to me is it seems like nobody is willing to have the conversation of what do we do to get people off of pharmaceuticals. It's just like a given that you're on this forever now. And I think that that's something that should be talked about a little bit more, is getting people off of these things, because I don't think that overall they are the best option for most people. Again, there's a subset who are not okay and probably do need them. But for the majority of people, I do think that there are probably better alternatives. So that's just my 2 cents. That is all that I have for you guys today. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my analysis regarding Gen Z. I am curious to see what you guys think. If you have any other factors as to why this generation is so screwed, let me know in the comments down below, and I will talk to you guys all next time. Bye!